Mark Mills has been here before, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, expert on energy and environmental policy. Mark's going to kick us off here and have a discussion about reasonable energy. One thing I want to share quickly is that Discovery Institute has a new involvement in energy policy, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. We've just launched a website. It's kind of in beta form, but it's reasonable.energy, and there is a report that you can get at the table out front if you'd like. Love to share with you kind of what we're doing on that issue. All right, Mark, take it away.
It was a terrific lead-in, Michael, thank you. I don't need to introduce Michael, my co-panelist. You all know him well now. And fellow co-panelist, Todd, who you can find out, like me, more than we would probably want you to know by going online. But the one thing I'm jealous about with Todd is if it's still true, you have, 200,000 bees?
Yes, 200,000 honeybees. And the thing I like about saying 200,000 honeybees is that's 4 hives. It sounds very impressive.
No, it's great. You got to say it that way. This is where numbers matter. So in listening, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of framing our discussion, both in the context of what I want to press Michael on. He and I have known each other 25 years. I mean, it's been a while. 30 years, 20, some long time. And we met over energy issues, in fact. Nuclear probably was the triggering subject. But I'm gonna take the prerogative of framing our conversation, particularly given the nature of COSM. And as some of you probably know, of a certain age, George sponsored Power Cosms back in the day of Telecosm that Peter Huber and I put on under George's chairmanship. So this could be called the Micro Power Cosm panel right here.
Good one. I'm the only one that appreciates that joke, I think. Good one.
Well, the microcosm was big, and so the framing matters, and you probably will. I'm going to lay out some facts for a few minutes just to frame our discussion, and relate it to the subject matter of this conference, which has been AI, graphene. You've heard of graphene by now. I'm a graphene fan, like George, and China, which was a subject that was much more heatedly debated between George and Newt a couple of years ago. But there's a relationship to the energy subject, and I'm going to tell you some facts, and you'll probably wonder why you hadn't heard some of these facts. Now you know why. If you listen to Michael's disquisition and eloquence on the industrial complex that is in information denial. This is the silence industrial complex. So I'm going to briefly refer to George's comments about the Neanderthal man and I'll call it the ontology of energy. So the holy trinity of civilization is, of course, law and order, a meritocracy, and cheap energy. So the link to this panel is that the trinity of the existence of the universe that we're in is energy, information, and materials. Nothing exists except at the intersection of those 3 things. Everything that is different about today, as George said, is information about the atoms in the universe that are exactly the same as they were at the time of Neanderthal man. Nature is the perfect recycler. The atoms, with a very trivial exception, are exactly the same on Earth as they were then. But we know a lot more about how to arrange those atoms, and the atoms could only be arranged to make products and services by expending energy, because the rearrangement is anti-entropic, and in the physics of the universe that we inhabit, that always and everywhere consumes energy. So speed, beauty, convenience, comfort, all the things that we cherish always consume energy. So the material domain is really irrelevant. So let's do it with George's favorite, graphene, and point out that the big difference between our life and previous times is what we build things out of. And the things we use to build things consume energy. Not that they provide energy, they consume energy. So wood is a structural material that has been supplanted, not eliminated, by steel. Steel is about 10 times more energy intensive per ton to make than wood. We use a lot of wood still, but we use megatons of steel. Aluminum, George's aluminum moment, aluminum is another 10-fold increase in energy cost per ton over steel, and we use aluminum not to eliminate steel by and large, but to do different things. And then there's silicon, which is another 30-fold increase in energy cost per ton to make silicon over aluminum, or compared to steel. It's a 300-fold increase in energy cost per ton or per kilogram. We make silicon in the silicon age by the kiloton, such that its energy consumption is equal to making megatons of steel. The overall nature of materials that create the civilization that we have now, overall, on average, requires a consumption of 10 to 100 times more energy per unit of material to make civilization possible in modern era compared to any time in history. So now comes graphene, and I'll tie this together with, so graphene is going to be more like silicon. The energetics of making graphene, which is a magic material, more analogous to silicon than aluminum, will, based on the technical literature today, probably have the energetics of making silicon itself. That's meaningful because we're going to make lots of graphene and we'll consume lots of energy making graphene to perform new functions and not replace graphite or not replace aluminum necessarily, but to do different and new things. Such is the nature of all progress. In effect, you put it this way, with materials and machines, humanity has been much, much better and much more fecund at inventing demands for energy than inventing ways to produce energy. That's the invention of the car created a demand, which consumed energy, the invention of the airplane, the invention of the computer. And to switch into the AI link to energy, the invention of the computer led to a world where we went from no energy being consumed to do computation to where global cloud today consumes as much energy as global aviation. Global cloud is growing faster than global aviation. We probably all suspect as much. And now will, in energy terms, grow far faster because of the advent of AI. One thing that was missing from the taxonomy of conversation about AI so far is that it's the single most energy-intensive use of silicon ever devised. It is, to use analogies are always weak, it's the equivalent of going from the steamship to the aircraft. Ships still have functionality. We use more ships now than we did 100 years ago, but we fly a lot. And energy cost per kilogram mile flying people and goods is self-evidently far greater. AI is an energy hog. It's made the AI community sort of secretively and nervous about it because the energy costs to build the infrastructure are off the chart astonishing. To calibrate it for you, when the group that produced for us ChatGPT first used the large language model to solve Rubik's Cube, it consumed the amount of electricity that I will put in Tesla terms. It consumed 1 million Tesla miles worth of electricity. The efficiency of the models got better, and then a few years later, they built ChatGPT, the first version that was unleashed on the world, and that, to train it, consumed 4 trillion Tesla miles of electricity. It needs to be continually retrained, and operating at the inference phase also consumes electricity. In fact, by most analyses, consumes 10 times more electricity in the inference mode than in the training mode. Net, Google's pointed out that doing search amplified by AI, which we would all like, I want my search to be better, not suppressed, will increase the energy costs of the data centers by probably 400%. I can hear you thinking, because they say it, they'll make it more efficient. Yes, they will, and that will increase energy consumption. It's the most delicious example of Jevons paradox ever invented by mankind. Computing at today's, your iPhone at 1980 compute energy efficiency would consume all the electricity that this building consumes. The reason there's more iPhones than there are people in the world is because the energy efficiency improved by tens of thousands of fold. In fact, the energy efficiency of compute today compared to the dawn of compute is 1 billion-fold better, which is exactly why global cloud consumes as much energy as aviation now, because of efficiency. So IBM announced 2 weeks ago a new neuromorphic chip that was 25 times more energy efficient than any current GPU for doing inference. That will cause the consumption of electricity to proliferate because the utility function for AI will proliferate. So AI is an energy hog. Is that good or bad? Well, depends on how you worry about energy. One last factoid, and then I'll switch to China, and then I have a question for my co-panelists. As of today, global consumption of electricity for the cloud is 10-fold greater than global consumption of electricity by all EVs combined. If Kathy Wood is right, she could be, and we have hundreds of millions of EVs in the world a decade from now, they will still consume a fraction of the amount of electricity that global cloud will consume, and in fact, AI will accelerate that difference. So what global cloud requires is extremely reliable electricity. What all of civilization requires is extremely reliable and cheap energy and cheap electricity. It is a little shocking that the 18,000-word executive order issued 2 days ago, Monday, by the Biden administration to dictate Stasi-like how AI will be used and not used, and people how will be punished, and how it will be monitored. It contains not a word about its energy costs and climate impact, not one word. It's interesting. I don't think that will last, but that's the state of affairs given who I think probably wrote the executive order. So what are we going to do to produce the electricity? Well, that's the essential question that the Inflation Reduction Act seeks to answer by putting to work not $700 billion of appropriated money, but when properly costed $2 to $3 trillion of money over the next decade is going to be deployed principally on windmills, solar arrays, and electric vehicles in the interest of an energy transition to fuel what everybody agrees will be greater energy demand for a future. Let me calibrate where we are in the energy transition and then turn to a question. So that money will be spent to buy windmills, solar panels, and batteries and battery supplies that are supplied by China. The Inflation Reduction Act, according to the administration, will reduce the U.S. emissions of carbon dioxide by a gigaton per year. 10 years from now, China will increase its carbon dioxide emissions by 3 gigatons per year within the next decade because they're burning more coal to fabricate the energy-intensive silicon. They make 90% of the world's silicon to sell to us to increase the cost of our economy. They make 80% of the input materials for lithium batteries and will for the next decade. And they make, by the way, 60% of the world's aluminum. And if this keeps going this way, they'll make most of the world's graphene, I would add. Something George should worry about. I don't think that's going to be a good thing for the climate apocalyptics because they are able to do that because their grid is 2/3 coal-fired and will be for the next half century. So we have a policy to increase the cost of our energy, and the West is doing the same in Europe, and China has a policy to decrease and maintain low-cost energy to produce energy-intensive goods for us and for the world. The money that's been spent so far, $5 trillion on avoiding hydrocarbons over the last 2 decades, has resulted in a world that today, 3.8% of the world's energy comes from wind and solar. 3.8. The share of world's energy supplied by hydrocarbons has decreased in that time by 2 percentage points. The absolute consumption of hydrocarbons has gone up by the amount equal to 2 Saudi Arabia's worth of production. So we have not caused a transition. In fact, burning wood still supplies nearly 3 times as much energy to the world as all the wind and solar combined. There is no evidence of an energy transition, but there is evidence of a lot of money being spent. All the things I've said to you, you have probably, unless you read what I write, haven't heard, because I'm in a new category that's been defined by the thought police called climate solutions disinformation, climate solutions denialism. Okay. So first I'm going to put to Michael the question, since I know he agrees with me that the energy plan we have in play is economically insane, socially and morally destructive, what are we to do? What's the energy policy? What's, our title? Reasonable and Pragmatic. That's a tepid title for the Swan Song panel, but what's reasonable and what's pragmatic? What should we do, given what I just said?
I think the most important thing is to embrace energy abundance. Energy is what the old idea from the 60s was that to save nature, you need to reduce energy consumption and materials consumption. But as you pointed out in your really terrific book, The Bottomless Well, which had a big impact on me, and also I point out in Apocalypse Never that using energy is how we save nature, and that energy is often a substitute for nature. So I showed that slide at the end showing Spain and France having allowed, more grasslands and wood and forests have returned in those countries as they've produced more food on less land. The same thing's happened here in the United States with the Maine woods, the New England woods, Martha's Vineyard. They've been reforested because the productivity of agriculture has increased in places like Iowa. Well, all of that agricultural productivity increased thanks to energy in the form of fertilizer, tractors, irrigation. And so the older view is wrong. We save nature by not using it, and we avoid using nature by using it more efficiently or creating substitutes from energy. Farming being the big one, but really the substitution of coal and fossil fuels for wood has allowed forests to regrow, and then the use of energy in agriculture has allowed for more intensive production. I do think, though, that we should also embrace Not all fossil fuels are equal. Natural gas is obviously better. If you ask a high school student, what do you think is a better fuel from an environmental point of view, burning coal or burning gas? Everybody knows burning gas. They can predict that burning coal in their kitchen would create a huge mess, but they burn gas every day. And we have abundant gas. Our mutual friend Jesse Ausubel, following the Russians, thinks that the amount of gas is infinite because it's produced by the Earth's core. It's a minority view, but
I'm in that camp.
you are. Are you
Abiogenic
you're an
gas.
abiotic guy. Yeah,
I'm an abiotic guy. It's
That's awesome.
but there's both methane, anyway.
Yeah,
we
and
don't
it's
want to digress on abiotic gas.
Yeah.
But for practical purposes, it's an infinite supply.
That's right. And so there's no need for solid fuels anymore. I mean, this is the good news. Nobody needs to use wood or dung or coal. You can use natural gas. But that means we have to unleash the gas production. We need more pipelines. We need more LNG facilities. I think this is a moral issue. There's no reason that people in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia should be using anything but gas or propane or butane or kerosene. So for me, abundance is the key, and then moving up the energy ladder from coal, wood and dung and coal to natural gas, and ultimately to uranium. And my view of nuclear, I'm a heretic among heretics because I think that the best nuclear is the nuclear we have. The second best is nuclear similar to the kind that we have. Is a very path-dependent technology, very path-dependent, capital-intensive, slow turnover. Nuclear plants should last 100 years. So I'm not in the category of Bill Gates and others that support these futuristic small reactors. I think the nuclear we have is the best. But that's the vision, and I think that if the political right wants to compete with the left on an environmental agenda, it would be a gas and nuclear agenda, or what's sometimes called end-to-end.
So you and I are in the same camp.
Thank you.
On nukes. Macron is going to do exactly what you are hoping and recommend. He's going to double the nuclear fleet. Germany should restart theirs because they can be restarted. If you want nukes, you build what we know how to build. But I'm in the middle camp that I'm desperate to unleash the 72 other designs. There's 72 different designs for nuclear power plants, all of which are feasible technically. We don't know which ones are economical. It'll take us a decade to figure that out. Let's start. But if you want to build nukes, you build what you know how to build. But Jesse, you mentioned Jesse Ausubel. So what he has pointed out in his data is something utterly fascinating. I want to turn to Todd because this gets to, he has pointed out that the abundance that's needed is for the world's 6.5 billion who have nothing or very little. And we in the West have been dematerializing. He and I have some arguments about what that really means, but largely speaking, as we improve our sophistication, our information systems, as we improve our ability to understand how to use energy, we have been decreasing rapidly the energy cost per unit of economic output, really remarkably. It's really hard for anybody else to do that in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's easier for us. So the moral case I would make is add to yours. If we want to look for a political meet in the middle, we'll do nukes, more gas, but also more efficiency because we now have a new tool for that. AI is certainly an incredible tool for sophisticated nations to do that. And Todd has done a lot of work thinking about the link between what we can produce and then optimizing and minimizing the consequences of using, because all use of energy, including my favorite, nukes, is consequential. So, Todd, tell us what you're up to with AI and energy.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about sort of the political challenges of I think we can absolutely agree that energy abundance is where we should go for a variety of reasons. One, either to accommodate AI's increased needs, but also to address the problems in Africa and other places where they simply need energy to grow. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the environmental director at the Washington Policy Center. I actually have been doing this for about 25 years. Used to work at the State Department of Natural Resources. After 25 years of being a center-right environmentalist in Washington State, I drink a lot, but I've also learned a lot about sort of the mindset and how you deal with that mindset. And so your presentation was really fantastic because I think one of the key things that people don't understand, they talk about environmentalism as a religion, and I think it absolutely is in many ways, but it's also an identity. People think of identity politics as, being race or gender or other things like that, but when somebody makes an issue an identity, they are virtually impervious to sort of rational thought and data and things like that. I'll give you a great example. I was giving a presentation to the Seattle Chamber of Commerce about green building standards. And the research that I had done showed that green schools in Washington State were actually using more energy per square foot than the non-green schools in those same districts. Okay.
How embarrassing. I need to see that.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is that I did it in Washington State, and then I started doing it in other states as well.
This would fall under a misinformation campaign that would have been long ago suppressed.
Yes.
No wonder nobody's heard of it.
So, and the beauty was that I was just showing the data, and there was a member of the committee who had come in, who had biked there and was in a full bike suit with bike shoes. And he, in the middle of my presentation, literally pounded his fists on the table and said, "What you're saying is immoral." Well, all I was saying was, look, here's the actual literal performance from the utility data in this. And he was rejecting it because what environmentalists who have created environmentalism as an identity here is not the data, it is you're a phony. You're living a fraud. And so that was what my first book was about, called Eco-Fads, is how people identify with these issues and how they fall for these fads and how they internalize them. And so it was very frustrating, and I wanted to see, as somebody who cared about the environment, how we can do more rational policy and how we can overcome this identity barrier that is built up by the disinformation that you're talking about. And we see that disinformation still today in Washington State. So something I was going through some utility data earlier this year, because we now have a carbon cap and trade in Washington State. And so the Utility Commission is approving rate increases for various utilities to accommodate the new CO2 charge that's in Washington State. And so they approved one for natural gas for Puget Sound Energy, but they also added a thing that said it is illegal for Puget Sound Energy to list this charge, this carbon charge, on customers' bills, because they said it would be too confusing. Now,
This sounds familiar from a speech we just heard.
yes,
Don't let the facts confuse us here.
that's exactly right. And they went on to say that for those families who get a rebate, because there is a low-income rebate that basically removes that charge from them, they said that you have to list. So listing the charge was too confusing. Listing the rebate for people who got it was required. So you would have this strange situation where you would actually have families who got the rebate who would not know what the rebate was for. They would actually think that their bills were going down rather than up. So disinformation is part of this whole thing. So the question, back to your question, how do you deal with this? And that's what the work that I have done is about, is that we can fight this stuff head on. And that's the work that I do, that Michael does, that a lot of us do every day, is to expose it, to fight it. But fundamentally, what you have is a fight, a political fight. And sometimes you win those fights and sometimes you don't. We now have an opportunity to get around that fight and to put more power in the hands of individuals, because when you feel the consequences of your own decisions, you are more likely to make rational decisions. The guy in the bike suit could deny that green schools used more energy despite the data because he felt no consequences, but he got an emotional benefit from believing that green schools were better. If he had to pay those prices, it would be very different. And in fact, many of the school directors that I spoke with around the country would email me, and I would always get this email from these folks saying, it said, "Hey, I read your piece about my school district." And I would go, "Uh-oh, I am about to get yelled at." And all of them said, "Thank you for saying this, because I am having to deal with this and I can't get my school board to recognize it." Technology and AI now allow us to put power in the hands of individuals so that disinformation has a less powerful impact on them. Disinformation in the energy sector and the environment sector works well when decisions are made by government and politicians. That's why they banned Puget Sound Energy from listing it, the cost on their bill. But the more you see your own costs, and thanks to AI, you can now do it. On my phone, I have an app that can tell me literally to the watt how much my house is using right now. Because we have access to information, and artificial intelligence can help us use that information to conserve energy and save money in a way that we never could before. That, I think, is as exciting an aspect of AI and energy as anything else. So we need to keep doing what Michael is doing and what I'm doing in fighting the disinformation and fighting the wrong information and exposing it. But fundamentally, if we don't break the political control of energy decisions, it's just planners versus planners. Some planners choose wind and solar, some planners choose nuclear and natural gas, and the people who end up with the decisions are the public. Give the public more power, and we can make the bad decisions less harmful, and we can make that so that when people make bad decisions, they pay the costs.
This is free market subsidiarity, which Michael agrees to. It's classic conservative philosophy. It's actually classic civilizational meritocracy. You want to give people power, information, act on. But let me push back on a challenge we have in the energy domain. It's the same challenge as we have in the Black Lives Matter domains, as we have in the COVID domains. I worked in an earlier career in bioweapons detection and protection. I learned an awful lot long before COVID about bioweapons, how viruses and bacteria transport, what you can do to detect them. How we actually made systems in a previous life that were installed in the Pentagon to detect biopathogens in the air, to early warnings, like smoke alarm for perps putting bioweapons in the air. Anyway, and it just drove me crazy, the disinformation and the positive information that you couldn't find you literally was suppressed. You couldn't find it. If you worked hard enough drilling down the Google layers, Google Scholar, you could find the data really hard. So here's the challenge with giving citizens information about their electric bill. You know what I'm going to say. They're not getting the facts. And the facts are distorted profoundly by the structure of the regulatory process and the subsidies. So the real cost of solar is not the cost that people are paying. There is a real cost that's paid by society because governments are profoundly good at mandates. You know, it's like the shell game with the nut, and we move it. You got to go find. It's like where's Waldo? Find the real cost. So we know at the macro level in every state and in every country of Europe, increased penetration of wind and solar leads to higher electric bills. Full stop. There's no exception. So then you look at it and say, well, they're telling us it's cheaper because the life cycle cost stuff, all that elliptical blather. And it is true that when a windmill is operating, its spontaneous cost of electricity is lower than when the gas turbine is operating, usually. But it's irrelevant in a system. If it were the case, every data center that I know, I used to do a lot of work in data center power systems, would disconnect from the grid, build solar panels and windmills and batteries, and they would just get off grid. And they're not doing that. So the question I would put to both of you, and this is not that if people are given the information that they will act on it, and AI gives us a tool, but that tool is disintermediated by exactly the actors you talk about, especially in Silicon Valley. I gave a presentation in Silicon Valley to a group of data center operators, and I laid out data like I just did, and then a lot more because it was a data center nerd fest, and pointed out that they're the giant sucking sound for new electron demand. And you heard Elon Musk recently say, he gave an interview before the annual conference of the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for the national utilities. He berated all the executives for saying, you guys are not planning to build enough power plants. He did not mean for EVs, because he knew the fact that I just laid out to you, that EVs are 1/10 the demand of the cloud. He also knows what AI consumes. He's an AI bull. And it was a funny response. Here they are, because they're a fully emasculated industry, not sure what to say to their new favorite guy making EVs, telling them they're not building enough power plants. So we have a profound level of misunderstanding in the intelligentsia, in government, in academia about the real costs of energy. And we have a regulatory system that's biased against revealing it. I guess I'll come back to, you can resist. When I publish stuff like this, or dozens of my colleagues publish stuff like this, very few people see it, and very little of it has entered into the lexicon of the debate that's going on. So what do? Do we just wait till electricity bills go to $1 a kilowatt hour? Because that's where they're heading in Europe, and we're going to follow that path. How do we push back? How do we get the right information into the system? Or broadly speaking, how do we restore some sense of the markets and engineers building the power systems inside of broad environmental boundaries as opposed to being dictated what to build? I mean, how do we get there? I want to build nukes too, but you know why we're not.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit what you and I were talking about before the panel started, which is that, about 20 years ago, John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, started Center for American Progress and Media Matters. And they did so because they said that the left was losing the war of ideas, and that Heritage Foundation and AEI and Manhattan Institute were winning the war of ideas. 20 years later, the left has definitely been winning the war of ideas. Yeah, they won. And so you have Inflation Reduction Act, the Orwellian named Inflation Reduction Act, that now expects to spend about $1 trillion. It was, or $2 million, depending on what happens next. And so the left has sort of achieved everything. If you look at all these issues, including the trans issue, and the race issue, I mean, they didn't really have anything else to do. I mean, we've desegregated everything. You have widespread affirmative action on race. We have same-sex marriage, and then on climate, they just achieved this huge. I mean, after decades of subsidies, they achieved even more. I think the burden is on the right to offer some new vision. And for me, I think that, Milton Friedman famously said, the point is you create policy alternatives so that when there's a crisis, they get picked up in a crisis. And whether, not getting into whether or not there's going to be a crisis, because experts are awful at predicting anything about the future. People always say, they always ask me, they go, what's going to happen next? Who knows? I mean, it's like, experts are terrible at guessing. This is as bad as the average member of the public. But I do think to have some clarity around it, and that's why I emphasize the gas and nuclear part. I think the right has, both in Europe and also in the United States, there's still a bunch of coal guys that support the conservative political parties, and that's been a bit of a challenge. When I testify before Congress, it's always uncomfortable when I criticize coal because the Republicans, they think that all fossil fuels are the same, but obviously they're not. So I do think it's important to articulate that different vision so that when there is some sort of a crisis and we can kind of unwind some of these really bad subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, we have some alternative. But I think that includes this broader vision. I mean, there is a way in which it's like, you're just dealing with a really dogmatic, fanatical, apocalyptic religion. And so the moments when policymakers are able to pull back from that stuff is when you have a recession or a war or something that is going to require some that has a reduction of revenues requiring some reduction in spending.
Well, I just want to pick up something that you said, which is that it is incumbent upon the right to provide an alternative. That is absolutely correct. And I think that those on the right, especially in energy and environment, are sometimes their own worst enemies because they spend all of their time pushing back on the left rather than offering an alternative approach. And so I think, it is easy to gainsay everything that the left does because, one, it's easy, right? They give us the opportunity. They have a lot of dumb ideas, but it is too seductive, and we get trapped in that rather than offering something that is constructive as an alternative. And so I think that's the big, I think we need to make sure that we're not just doing that we are saying, here's a better way to achieve many of these goals. As I said, I did not grow up an environmentalist. When I was in university, when I was in college, the people who were interested in environment looked bad and smelled weird. I did not hang out with those people. My sister did.
I'm sitting right here, dude. I'm like sitting right next to you.
That's right.
You're saying this.
That's right. This is
I
not
can
personal.
hear you.
My sister hung out with those folks, and she married a woman. So, so see what an
happens.
influence she had on, they had on her. But once I, got into the environmental policy space sort of accidentally, I started to see that I could be interested in it and be true to my values. And so that, I think, is that we need to start by having the courage of our own values and convictions, that we can care about environmental stewardship and still be true to what we believe, and it is absolutely the case. So that, I think, is the first thing. But you asked, okay, so the problem with, electricity and empowering people is that the prices are all wrong. Absolutely. Name me an industry that isn't true, right? Housing.
It's always a matter of degree, and
Right.
and there's no black and white because people attach values
Correct.
to everything, hardware, social services, and that's okay. But back to your point, if it was labeled, you could just call it broadly a labeling. Here's what I'm attaching this value to it. I'm going to, whether it's a carbon label, whether it's because I hate utility label, but that's not what's going on.
But we have to take a step in that direction. So if I ask people, what does a kilowatt hour cost in Washington State? This is a smart audience. My guess is some people would know, but not everybody. If I asked you what the cost of a gallon of gas is right now, within a few cents, everybody would know. Why? Because it is everywhere. It is on every street corner. But the kilowatt hour price is not. And so when political games are played with energy costs, with wind and solar, it is very opaque to the general public, and so it is hard for them to respond. That's not true with gasoline. When gas, when there's a tax placed on gas, when there's votes about gas, everybody gets involved, everybody has an opinion. So you're right, the prices are a mess, but the first step is transparency. And the good or bad thing is that there is still a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to making our energy system more transparent, getting people involved and giving them more power so that the final decisions aren't being made by the people that Michael has done such a good job of highlighting.
Yeah, you're right. There is, so it's technically possible, easier now. There's low-hanging fruit in this, and let's just stipulate because I've spent unintentionally a lot of my time batting back silly ideas. So being the nego, the anti, because it's silly to say that all cars will be electric. It's just silly. It's silly to say we can make a grid all wind and solar. In every possible way, it's silly. It's immoral, impossible, all these things. But because that takes effort, because we're spending so much money on it, then all the oxygen's sucked out of the room, because then what happens if you have enough time is people invariably say, okay, you beat me up, you convinced me, what do we do? So to your point, and you're saying the same thing, we'll call it the anti-energy transition movement, because there's no transition. The choices have to be too varied and too broad for the world, have to offer a vision, and there is no vision being offered. And then you can push, I think, harder to get transparency. I will say that the battle we have to win first is probably the one you outlined, which is the ability to get the information out at all. Because in my experience, people who are well-meaning and very smart believe things that just aren't true because they believe this information.
Yeah, well, that's why.
I was going to jump in,
Yeah, go ahead.
but Steve is hovering.
Yeah, Michael,
The Grim Reaper is here.
I just wanted.
Is this a Monty Python skit where the Grim Reaper comes?
Michael, I'm only here to prove that it was not personal. Okay? But
I'm going to
let's
say
have
what
some
Michael said. Do
parting
you want us to
thought-
finish? No, I'm
Well,
kidding.
let's have some parting thoughts, and then we're going to wrap up in about 3 minutes.
I'll leave the parting thoughts because I began with a rant to Michael, you and
I'll just do my last parting thought, which is I think that for the political right, I think the evolution ought to be from framing this as a problem of markets versus government, where the right is like we're for markets and they're for government, because it's just too mixed up. I mean, the electric utilities are natural monopolies, and so they're inevitably regulated by the government, and so you can't get the government out if you tried to. And I think, I think the other issue, and just to maybe it's a language thing, there are energy transitions. I mean, we transitioned from wood and dung to coal, and then we're transitioning right now from coal to natural gas.
Not to beat this to death, we use more wood today for fuel than 100 years ago. in absolute terms.
But we should not.
But we are. I mean,
Yeah.
It's a transition in share, not in absolute quantities.
Yeah. I mean, we're using less coal in the United States than
Yes,
we were,
but not
thanks to
globally.
gas. Not globally, but that we will. But I think that's the right way to think about it and to propose it, setting aside the issue of whether it's happening. That's what should happen. And I think that there's just not that many fuels. And so I think there's been this idea that energy is really complicated. It's really not. There's only a few fuels. And most people already know which one's the better one. That's why I spent like 10 years advocating for nuclear, just to help people understand that uranium is better than coal. But I do think that that's where I would put my emphasis. It's on fuels. And yeah, and then in terms of cutting the waste, just all the other garbage that people are sold around. I'm dying to see your report, by the way. Please send it to me on the inefficient schools. That's amazing. But that's what I would recommend, to simplify this a little bit and just be like, it's about gas and nuclear, not about markets versus government.
Yeah, Todd, you get the final word and a chance to plug your book. I hope.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, and that I think is where I want to finish, which is a lot of these discussions that I have with folks on the center right are very depressing, because in a lot of ways things are moving in a very bad direction, not just in Washington State, but nationwide. But the beauty is that I think that there is an opportunity, and we do have that opportunity to provide that alternative that is more tangible than just markets versus government, right? I think that it is more personal, that it's more meaningful to individuals. And so so I have my book I wrote called Time to Think Small, as an alternative to sort of big government top-down approaches that show that technology is now allowing people to solve problems that politicians either are unwilling to or simply cannot, and can engage on these issues and be empowered and shift the power dynamic so that the influence of disinformation, lack of transparency, mean less in our daily lives. So it's not just about improving energy abundance or helping the environment. It's also about recalibrating the relationship of people and the state. And there's lots of good opportunities. And the good news is that this is a nonpartisan. It is across the spectrum that people are recognizing this. The foreword to my book is written by a young woman named Talia Speaker, who works with a group called Wild Labs. She was a wildlife biologist, and she was very frustrated about the lack of progress she was seeing on environmental issues. Well, she works with the World Wildlife Fund, and she now is looking at technology as the way to solve problems rather than government. So there is a frustration that is across the board that government policies spend a lot, cost a lot, but don't do a lot. And technology and individual empowerment allows us to tap that so that this isn't just a right versus left. This isn't just government versus markets, that this can reach lots of people, and we can change that important dynamic, not just about how people relate to government, but for the benefit of energy and the environment.
Let's have a round of applause. Yeah.